Avalanche, Chapter 7, The Immortal Patterns Behind Reality. Throughout this book, I've been presenting information about patterns and the importance of being able to read patterns of reality, whether such patterns are experienced in the inner reality of the psyche or in the outer reality of the manifest world. What are patterns? Dreams are patterns of interrelating intrapsychic forces. Visual images are patterns of electromagnetic energies. Patterns are the basis of scientific, mathematical, and psychic regularity and predictability. The various personality aspects of the conscious senses of self are patterns. The transcendental senses of self are patterns. The basic themes of our lives reflect patterns of the unconscious. Patterns, though perceived as either single events or as a series of events in time and space, are, from my current perspective, independent of time and space. Whether we are aware of them or not, patterns, the relationships of patterns, and sequences of patterned unfoldment are what give each of us the experience of reality. Patterns of forces are what give objects, events, and ourselves reality and meaning. These patterns and the realities that are generated through them are essential and intrinsic. The givens that underlie manifestation have nothing to do with right or wrong, good or bad, preferred or not preferred. We can begin to approach this profound area of understanding by thinking of life as reflecting a great mystery play. A play ingeniously well orchestrated, determined by the very nature of matter itself, and flawlessly enacted by characters generated out of matter's mysterious yearning to come into being. Most writers of such art forms as plays, novels, short stories, operas, and ballets know that there are only a few basic plots, and that's all. Their creative endeavors will reflect one or the other, or a combination of these relatively few basic patterns or themes. Great works of fiction, as well as individuals, will often have many or all of these plots interwoven into one great expression of life. The fundamental dynamics of life reflect this same fact, and there are only a few basic patterns around which life, as we know it, infinitely dances. Current theories regarding matter and chaos suggest, in fact, that there are approximately 100 fundamental patterns into which chaos can move and become coherent. Through the interaction of these approximately 100 possible patterns come what appear to be infinite variations of expression. I am likewise intrigued by the fact that, at the time this is written, only 109 chemical elements are known to exist. Everything we encounter in the physical world, whether organic or inorganic, is comprised of patterns of one or more of these basic chemicals. Then, when one reviews the subatomic composition of each of the chemical elements, one is appreciating the unique pattern of each chemical element itself in space and time. The patterned way that elements, compounds, and mixtures get along at the physical level is very similar to how human beings get along at the psychological level, and is the basis of my working hypothesis for understanding the relationship between mind and matter. A good example of how basic patterns appear over and over again can be discovered in examining the basic theme of Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet, and of Leonard Bernstein's musical West Side Story. A brief perusal of both reveals the classic theme of ill-fated lovers. The basic similarity of theme or pattern is concealed by the differences in culture, geography, historical period, backgrounds of the characters, and manner of presentation. Nonetheless, love entangles two innocents in a circumstance that precludes their being able to have a relationship. Tragic death resolves the conflict in both stories. We don't grow tired of seeing this pattern depicted in any number of apparently different stories. I believe the reason we don't grow tired of this recurring pattern is that it is fundamental to our nature and somehow essential to our beingness. It is fundamental to the nature of matter. We can have an infinite number of different men and women play the parts of Romeo and Juliet and have them engrossed in an infinite number of conflicting family circumstances. But the pattern remains the same and always resolves through the death or through the substitution sacrifice of one, the other, or both of the ill-fated lovers. From the transpersonal viewpoint, the pattern is immortal, dancing in certain people of each generation in every culture of the world. A psychically sensitive person meeting the young lovers before death ensues and reading the pattern correctly would know the ill-fated lover pattern is active and that resolution through death is called for. This need for death can be satisfied through the ending of the lover's relationship, or the need for death can be satisfied through a ritual substitution sacrifice in which the psychological senses of self out of one or both lovers are sacrificed in place of the physical bodies. The need for death can be satisfied through the ritual substitution of life for another, as with human or animal sacrifices in the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic religions of the West and the Near East. Or the need for death in the ill-fated lover's pattern can be satisfied through the death of one or both lovers. Activating any of these options will satisfy the pattern, and death will cease to stalk, until, of course, one of the lovers who carries the pattern reconstellates that pattern in the next encounter with love. Patterns are carried for life, but may remain latent, and a specific pattern may not be activated in one's lifetime. We must remember, however, that the purpose of life is not to escape from or avoid patterns, but to recognize that they are what gives our lives meaning, and therefore represent our pathway to fulfillment. Thus, for example, from the transpersonal viewpoint, individuals swept up in the ill-fated lover's pattern, rather than trying to escape from the lethal configuration, to fulfill their lives, actually fulfill their lives, and therefore life, capital L, through the pattern. The sacrifice of life for love is not uncommon in our society. It simply means that the personal and mortal are sacrificed into the transpersonal and immortal. The outer mystery is sacrificed to the inner mystery. We are basically then but witnesses to the myriad physical and psychological patterns living through each of us. The patterns are immortal, and our unique relationship to them is, I believe, struck at the time of conception. In terms of the usual ways of expressing human existence, life, capital L, life lives us. We do not live life. Only through self-realization is there even a remote chance of our living a life with option over which patterns are activated and which patterns remain latent. And even then, we are restricted to those patterns which are intrinsic to our individual makeup. Unconscious patterns in relationships. An example of the pervasiveness of patterns and of patterned phenomena can be seen by examining two powerful, closely related unconscious patterns that are at the basis of attraction into the marriage relationship. The first deals with unconscious bondings to the countergender parent during infancy and early childhood. Okay, let me read that sentence again. The first deals with unconscious bondings to the countergender parent during infancy and in early childhood. The second, which is related to the first, in a most remarkable manner involves the fact that what one sees and becomes involved with in the outer world has a pre-existence and coexistent counterpart within the interior self. We can only relate to the outer aspects of life through the inner correspondences. The outer is only a reflection of the inner patterns. The attraction to another person is actually the attraction to a self contained in one's own self, capital S. We literally fall in love with parts of ourself. Not with conscious parts of ourself, but with unconscious parts of ourself, which have been projected onto whatever in the exterior world most closely resembles them. When those of us who have been through or are presently in a first marriage realize that we have married the pattern that represents our countergender parent, and that unless we become conscious of what is happening, we are destined to perform sexually based primary relationships only with persons who carry the basic patterning of the countergender parent. We begin to realize the personal importance of awakening into self-realization. I'm going to read that sentence again. When those of us who have been through or are presently in a first marriage realize that we have married the pattern that represents our countergender parent, and that unless we become conscious of what is happening, we are destined to perform sexually based primary relationships only with persons who carry the basic patterning of the countergender parent. We begin to realize the personal importance of awakening into self-realization. There is no hope of escaping these dynamics if we remain unconscious of them. No matter how many marriages we enter into, the unconscious will dance and control the relationships. Of course, the unconscious controls all relationships, but the primary spousal relationship contains the most powerful unconscious material, as it is based in parent-child pattern dynamics. This has biological and psychological survival value in that the attractive sexual forces of parent-child are transferred into dynamics that attract us to a spouse and lead therefore to continuity of the unconscious physical and psychological patterns that are being transmitted through the family or clan. Yet we scarcely recognize the profound ancestral components to the marriage, nor do we recognize how unfulfilled other aspects of the self, capital S, are when the primary dynamics being fulfilled in a marriage are those of the parent/child. If we want to appreciate these dynamics, the first marriage will tell us everything we need to know. If we can only recognize that a pattern is present, that it has to do with powerful and unconscious relationships with the parents, and that when this pattern is made conscious, new potential in the relationship as well as within the experiences of life is more readily available. A particularly astute reader of unconscious patternings can observe a child for a short time and discern all the patterns, or at least the major patterns, the child will enact in adult life. An intuitive person can hold a baby at birth, sense the patterns, and predict the general life themes of that particular infant. A highly intuitive person can hold that same baby and predict with astonishing accuracy not just the general patterning, but also actual specific events that will coalesce around those basic patternings. When well-developed intuitives, sometimes also referred to as sensitives or psychics, give a reading in quotes, they are reflecting patterns in the deep psyche. In my experience, such intuitives are 90 to 95% accurate at the general pattern level, and at best 60 to 70% accurate at the specific level. In fact, all sensitives are more accurate in reading general patterns. Of course, these percentages are not precise and cannot be applied to any specific individual, but they do point to a trend, and it is this trend about which I wish to comment. My own particular gift involves being able to read the general pattern levels of the deep psyche, to recognize the fundamental forces that are operating. I'm only moderately accurate in reading specific levels. Some people are gifted in regard to the specific levels, but may have no understanding of the general patterns, so they can miss the relationships between the general and the specific. Carolyn Conjure is an example of someone who is gifted in both areas. One person I often recommend, who was also the first person to do a formal reading on me, is Bella Karish. Karish? K-A-R-I-S-H. Bella Karish, whom I mentioned briefly in Chapter 2. I was overwhelmed by what Bella presented to me. In 3 hours, she took me apart on every level that you can imagine and put me back together again with deep intuitive insight and compassion. Had I known someone could read me that deeply, I might not have gone, no matter how integrated and balanced you usually feel. Anxiety and vulnerability quickly erupt when someone sees you more deeply and more intimately than you usually see yourself. This experience of anxiety and vulnerability in the presence of someone who knows things about you that you wouldn't want anybody to know can be really disturbing, at least until a more mature self develops, which can handle such candidness. I know this well from being around people such as Bella and Carolyn Conjure, especially Carolyn, as I lived with her for a number of years and was exposed to her intuitive awareness of me on a daily basis. I've also experienced the other side of this situation at my own conferences, where participants become anxious when sitting next to me in the dining area or in the seminar room because they assume I am reading or seeing their thoughts. Quite to the contrary, though my intuitive awareness is usually only active in the context of sessions in the seminar environment when I am specifically working with an individual. At the dining room table, I'm only interested in eating and being simple. And even when I'm aware of material that may be uncomfortable to an individual, doesn't mean that material has the same meaning to me as it does to the person. Most of the time, it is only a suchness to me, just a bit of information without a value system attached. Sometimes, although this possibility doesn't usually occur to the participants, I am just as concerned that they will pick up my thoughts or feelings. Most of the time, however, when I'm not working, I'm simply not interested in information coming in from heightened states of consciousness or from intuitive realms. This can shock the beginning students who tend to overvalue the expanded ranges of awareness. When I have listened to recorded sessions of Bella Karish's individual readings, I've been impressed by the phenomenally detailed revelations of deep unconscious patterns associated with the individual reading. Each reading covers sweeps of time and dimensions of consciousness, far beyond the usual ranges addressed by sensitive readers. Bella reads on many levels, using metaphysical themes and drawing heavily on reincarnational structures to tie her material together. Wayne, her partner, works with her during the reading, but stays in the background, using his highly developed intuitive capabilities to pose questions and to direct the overall reading from level to level. The result of such a reading is, in terms of Bella's model, a myriad of past lives. In my model, each past life is a pattern that is present in the unconscious and potentially active in the individual's life. Although I expressed a belief in reincarnational viewpoint in my first book, I am now exploring another possibility, one that can be used to understand the same material from an alternate perspective. My current view is that the key to understanding and appreciating what Bella and other past life readers are presenting is to reinterpret past life anecdotes in terms of there being active current patterns in the multiple selves of the unconscious rather than events in the past. There is, in fact, nothing in a past life reading, no character plot or theme that cannot be understood as a force presently acting in the unconscious. When this is recognized, one can ferret out the key unconscious patterns that are operating in one's life without getting stuck in literal or denotative interpretations of psychic readings. This shift in attitude about past lives occurred because I discovered that when I went to different sensitives, each would read the supposed past lives differently, yet the same basic themes or patterns would be embedded in these ostensible scenarios from the past. The names, places, and most of the superficial details of the past lives would be very different, just as West Side Story and Romeo and Juliet are different, though the patterns of the stories are basically the same. Through these experiences with many different readers, I suddenly became aware of the pattern level of reality. I saw the eternal dance, but of a limited number of themes and plots, combining and recombining, dancing as generation after generation, and having nothing to do with the personal self, that self which is but an illusion of consciousness and has only limited resources and options in relation to the forces that are actually manifesting us. Instead of seeing karma as personal and individual, I suddenly saw it as collective, impersonal, and immortal. All the patterns being read by the individual are those of impersonal forces manifesting through us. Each individual has a unique combination of the immortal patterns, determined by the energetics at conception. Life incarnates us and needs us. These patterns renew themselves in each generation and are present now, not somewhere in the past. We are only the latest vehicles acting out the forces in the great mystery play called life. Our only spiritual responsibility is, to the best of our ability, to fully live out those patterns that relate us to the wholeness of life. My 4th year of medical training brought me into obstetrics and gynecology. During the many deliveries I personally managed, not only was I awed by the process of birth, but I was also awed by what I sensed about some of the newborns. A few seemed predominantly to carry the angelic patterning of goodness and wholeness. A few seemed to carry the artistic patterning of struggle and crisis, and some carried the athletic patterning. Some carried the abandoned child pattern of self-rejection or being not good enough. And a few, much to my amazement, carried a sense of dark and destructive. As I have lived more and more of my life, I've begun to realize that some individuals are destined to live out almost exclusively that good and acceptable side for the collective. Some individuals are destined to live out almost exclusively the dark and disowned side for the collective. And most of us will be somewhere in between. Not only is an individual danced by these immortal patterns, but so also are the groups of individuals in their collectivity. By reading the collective group pattern and not the individual patterns making up a group at any one of my conferences, I can usually predict the overall outcome of the conference at the group level. As I noted in Chapter 5, at any moment during the conference, there will always be a few people who are miserable and unhappy with the conference and their relationship to the material being presented. There will also be a few people who are ecstatic and intoxicated by the conference and their relationship to the material being presented. Most of the participants, though, will be engaged by and grounded in the material. I cannot predict which individuals will be the high flyers of the collective and which will polarize around the shadow content. But it is possible to predict that a high flyer will revert to the pits, and that the individual who is in the pits will move into the high-flying experience. Both may oscillate for a while before they finally take up a position in the experience of the main group, but when they do so, generally 2 or more individuals will enter the energetics of the polar opposite. This is a fascinating observation, similar to what occurs in quantum mechanics, in which the behavior of huge quantities of light particles can be predicted, but a prediction regarding which particular photon will go where cannot be made. The phenomenon of mass predictability is evident in many areas, a well-known one of which involves the ability of insurance companies to make a profit despite the unpredictability of individual policyholders. It's also evident, of course, in the field of medicine, where group behavior in regard to a particular disease can be statistically displayed and is therefore predictable. Yet no one can accurately predict how any one individual in that group is going to respond to the disease or to its treatment. Actually, the whole field of medicine is based on predictable collective responses, within the boundaries of which is a remarkable range of possibilities for each individual. However, for the collective pattern to be fulfilled, only a certain portion of individuals can satisfy each aspect of the group. Here, between predictive group behavior and unpredictable individual behavior in the group, we confront a profound mystery. Is there a general pattern that superimposes itself over a collection of people and influences their overall behavior, while individual behavior can, to varying degrees, be independent? And if one's individual behavior is consciously directed into a certain area of action, is another individual's behavior unconsciously forced into a balancing reaction in order that an unchanged overall group response might be maintained. In regard to healing, it is possible for certain individuals in a group process to consciously latch on to the remarkable cures category of response. Remarkable cures in quotes. It's possible for them to consciously latch on to the remarkable cures category of response and therefore force others into the non-responsive category. Psychologically, when one group of people polarizes in the direction of the great good, capital G, great good, is another group moved thereby into the polarizing with balancing forces in the direction of the great evil. Of course, from a rational and intellectual perspective, such dynamics can easily be shown not to be valid, but from the non-rational and intuitive standpoints, they seem to be operating as fundamental principles in the unconscious. How we perceive events and think they have transpired, and how these same events, in fact, do transpire, represent two different orders of reality. We bump against the psychological perspective versus the factual perspective in the field of religion, as, for example, in Christ's virgin birth and in the Buddha's having been born from his mother's side. In the field of law, psychological versus factual orders of truth display themselves daily in the courtroom. There are many examples to support the assertion that there is a psychological or a subjective reality and a factual, intellectual reality, and thus I am further encouraged to pursue the realization around group dynamics and the patterns that seem to be operating in terms of both the rational, intellectual, and the non-rational, intuitive perspectives. Some interesting considerations along these lines became evident to me when I started to look into sibling dynamics within families. I was struck by how often the brothers and sisters seem to divide up the pie of the possible kinds of sibling behavior, as in the case of the sibling who becomes the black sheep of the family and the sibling who becomes religious, the sibling who becomes intellectual while other sibling becomes predominantly athletic. An unconscious tendency seems to exist for distribution into these and other basic sibling patterns. Even when an entire brood takes on the black sheep characteristics, perhaps another family grouping somewhere will act as a counterbalance by having children who are all saint-like and angelic. I was disturbed when I realized how individuals in my medical school class in just 20 years had been distributed into a classic bell-shaped curve pattern of life circumstances, from those involving drug addiction and alcoholism to others involving accolades and high achievement, as well as practically everything else in between. We have become yet one more predictable grouping of physicians satisfying some unconscious and powerful patterns. In seeking to recognize and understand patterns more clearly, I have come to believe that large cities may be a perfect reflection of the basic composition of the human unconscious. They appear to exhibit the same intrinsic patterns the world over, patterns that seem not to have changed in thousands of years. All of the immortal characteristics, from the most dark and malignant to the most beatific and celebrated, seem to incarnate each generation in every great city of the world. Is there a fundamental pattern of energy innate to the human psyche that guides or controls such development? So all great cities of any culture, in any era, past, present, or future, will always display such a similarity. And just as we are all divergent elements in the vast complexity of a large city and are able to coexist, is the same also true in regard to the human unconsciousness? Does this great city pattern force the individual elements to dance its dance, or do the individual elements create the dance of the city? I'm strongly leaning toward the former view, and from that perspective I am awed by certain insights. All the possibilities of existence are maintained and nurtured in the matrix of the city. All human potential is incarnate and renewed generation after generation. No aspect of any city is either right or wrong. All aspects reflect only the fully creative suchness of human life. All individuals of a city are interrelated and need one another for the entity of the city to survive and procreate. When someone interferes with the balances by such actions as attempting to do away with the ghetto or provide homes for the homeless, the entity called the city will reconstitute itself through time, initiate others into the ranks of its depleted, and restore the balance between the haves and the have-nots. As disturbing as this perspective sounds, there is much evidence to support its validity, as anyone knows only too well who has attempted to change the balance of lifestyles in a city. The poor will always be there, as will the sick, the indigent, the prostitutes, the corrupt, the exploiters of humanity, and the humanity that seeks exploitation. The good side of the town and the bad side of the town. Such aspects are natural and intrinsic to our deeper nature, and life is served by the maintenance of these balances. The individuals who make up these aspects may change, but the aspects themselves do not change, as they are innate. When I'm traveling in the world, I often have difficulty realizing which city I'm in. The same squalor, poverty, criminal elements, respectable restaurants, architecturally magnificent monuments, first-class hotels and flop houses, and bureaucracies and black markets all exist together. Saints are saving sinners. Sinners are unsterilizing the saints. The wealthy are do-gooding and exploiting the poor, while the poor continue to be initiated into rites of survival and passage, enabling them to be able to pass through calamitous circumstances without batting an eye, while the more sophisticated and well-off often crumble under the impact of chaos. Want to reach full self-realization? Want to reach full self-realization? Go live in and be reflected by the spectrum of the city. Be careful, though. You can't apply value systems appropriate to the family or to rural living when engaging the full force of a city. All aspects of life are represented there, and all those aspects, even the most apparently unsavory, are necessary and appropriate from the psychological perspective. The situation is no different from that of cells in the human body. In the body, some organizing force takes potential cells and directs their development into specialized parts that allow the overall survival and well-being of the whole body. Some cells are discovered to live as anal cells, while other cells are destined to live as sole of the feet cells, and still others are destined to live as BETZ, B-E-T-Z cells in the central nervous system. This isn't a matter of right or wrong, or of good or bad. It is the suchness of things, and cities likewise reflect the suchness of our psychological being in a vast, complex, and vibrant way. Tools for perception, pattern projections. Numerology and its relative astrology are two additional reflections of the fundamental psychological patterns contained in the human unconscious. While a rational intellectual perspective tends usually to view numbers in terms of arithmetic and counting, an intuitive perspective can also see them in terms of psychological symbolism. To a psychologically awakened individual, the numeral 1, for example, not only represents a single thing, but it also represents unity, oneness, totality, indivisibility, and that which is initial, the most important, or of the first order, to mention but a few of the most obvious aspects. Again, if systems such as numerology or astrology are approached only from the intellectual and factual viewpoint, they seem not to have a rational basis. Yet, when they are regarded from the psychological and symbolic viewpoints, they can be of immense help in understanding the principal dynamics of life and the human unconscious. Mystics and intuitives have no problem living with both the psychological and the intellectual realities of life, though the priesthood of rational science can become enraged by such thinking. Carl Jung, the great 20th century explorer of patterns of the unconscious, commented that the most amazing thing about numbers is that they communicate the same symbolism no matter whether they appear in the outer consciousness, in inner states, or in states of meditation. Numbers are consistent between dimensions of human psyche. Signs of the zodiac are also basically patterns of the deep psyche projected onto the configurations of stars. Mind and matter, the deep psyche and manifest reality, are as one at the level of mystery. Mind and matter, the deep psyche and manifest reality, are as one at the level of the mystery. The reason complex relationships among planets and zodiac signs can be used to predict the future or to reveal the basic life forces carried by an individual is that the deep psyche is behind the projected patterning. Crystal ball reading, an enigma to the uninitiated, is merely a way to focus the awareness while the unconscious patterns display themselves as impressions and projections into the crystal ball. These same general processes are used in palmistry, phrenology, iridology, reflexology. These same processes are used in palmistry, phrenology, iridology, reflexology, tarot card reading, divination with the I Ching, dream interpretation, and psychic readings in general. All are based on projection of the innate, unconscious patterns of the human psyche. When discussing how images and visions can be projected onto outer reality, I'm reminded of a powerful exercise I mentioned in Joy's Way, called the Trapasso, Trespasso. As one gazes steadily and unblinkingly at any objects, usually with the Trapasso at the face of a partner or at oneself in a mirror, images begin to manifest in outer reality in a most dramatic manner. This same phenomena is used sometimes by sensitives when they are doing readings. The person for whom the reading is being given can tend to dissolve in the mind of the sensitive, and other images will begin to appear, images that may contain information about the person being read. If the sensitive reports seeing an Indian or a little boy or an angel, he or she is not talking about outer material reality. Indeed, the images appear to be out there, but the source of the image is the deep psyche of the sensitive, which is somehow in relationship with the individual being read. The unconscious is projecting its impression onto outer reality, whether that reality be a crystal ball, the face of an individual, celestial configurations, or tea leaves. The really startling aspect of this process is that the genuine reader is not projecting something imaginary or concocted in his or her own mind, although that's always a possibility, but is somehow picking up information directly from the individual who is being read. A very powerful way to work with this pattern level phenomena is to do cloud readings, as some Hawaiian kahunas do. When one enters a heightened intuitive aspect of self, the deep psyche, which is not bound by time and space, can project onto the clouds a pattern that is germane to a question that has been posed. Or one's attention may suddenly be seized by a particular cloud pattern that alerts the outer mind to an event that is about to take place in the future, or even at a distance in some other part of the world. Predictive patterns manifesting as events can be seen in many other ways as well. For example, I was sitting on the front porch of a house on the beach on the island of Kauai, talking to a young woman who, because of a carcinoma of the chest, had recently had a mastectomy. The biopsies of her auxiliary lymph nodes were negative, and all studies pointed to her having a complete recovery. She had been impressing to me her appreciation for angels and the angelic dimension. As she continued to enter the conversation around her love of angels, I began to experience her seemingly innocent talk as her unconscious contemplating and orienting toward death. Then, as she was speaking, a single seagull flew by, swooped a few times, and then flew almost straight up in the air and disappeared. I knew she would die soon of her disease. An omen had been delivered through the very unusual flight pattern of the seagull. I cannot describe the extent to which this process is disturbing to my intellect, or how the process actually works, other than to report the intuitive knowing about her impending death was inescapable to me. I did not have the courage to tell her what I knew, and I supported her sense of recovery and well-being. She died a year later. Clearly, not every external event will be predictive, and an observer must discriminate between fantasy and actual psychic information. What is most likely to have psychic import is an unexpected event that breaks into or interrupts normal consciousness and has the feeling associated with intuitive knowing, a certain zing that distinguishes actually knowing the meaning of the event from merely being aware of possibilities and probabilities about the meaning of the event. A sequence of events that constitutes an omen for me, one that makes my hair stand up on end whenever it occurs, always begins late at night when I become aware of the sound of a bird's wings beating against the window and the sound of a bird's beak pecking against the glass. As I approach the window, I see a bird frantically trying to enter through the closed window. Even when I turn on the light and go to the window to scare the bird away, it persists in extraordinary behavior for 10 to 20 minutes before it stops, and then it just sits on the sill outside. Later it disappears in the night. Invariably, and I do mean invariably, someone close to me dies within 2 days of such an episode. The bird is different each time, but the pattern's always the same. These events, incidentally, are actual events and not dreams. I have 2 conscious associations with birds and death. One is that my mother used to be afraid a bird might fly into our house, as she believed it would mean a death was about to occur. The other is a very sad experience I had about the age of 10, when I was given a BB gun. I shot at, and to my surprise, hit a bird that was sitting on top of a telephone pole. It fell to earth, wounded, but not dead. And in my guilt and panic, I buried it alive. I have never quite forgiven myself for such an unthinking act, even though through that act, a compassion for other life forms was birthed in me. My psyche reads an omen of death in birds that act bizarrely at night. From the viewpoint of my rational mind, I have no idea how such events could happen. I only know they do. And of particular interest to me is the fact that the sequence, the pattern, is not reflected by events that might ordinarily be present in my outer reality. This unnatural behavior by birds seems somehow intended to catch my attention. It is caused by my unconscious, which already knows the death will transpire and activates the omen pattern, even causing a bird that happens to be around to act in a bizarre fashion to stimulate communication between the unconscious and the conscious parts of myself. The relationship between mind and matter often stuns me. Sacred creative patterns. In the world of what would generally be regarded as aesthetics, sacred creative patterns can provide moving ways to experience the phenomena of patterning, whether in the form of sacred geometry, sacred proportions in architecture, sacred combinations of sounds and music, sacred combinations of light and color in paintings, sacred or classical proportions in masterworks of sculpture, or sacred, heightened expression in literature, such as poetry and drama. And then in brackets it says, the Shakespearean plays of the West, or the No plays, or No plays of Japan. What distinguishes the sacred from the non-sacred is the object's resonance with, or its closeness to, a fundamental pattern. What a human collective calls beautiful, masterful, or aesthetic is related to correspondences between one of these inner patterns and an outer object or person. The more nearly the outer object or person corresponds to the unconscious original pattern, the more greatly it inspires and lifts us. There are, for example, ways to divide line into portions that create a pleasurable resonance in the human psyche. One, the so-called golden section or divine proportion, is produced when a line is divided into 2 unequal segments, such as the ratio of the whole line to the larger segment is equal to the ratio of a larger segment to the smaller segment. A rectangle whose length and width corresponds to this ratio is called a golden rectangle and somehow evokes a pleasant, uplifting response, inspiring us to recognize the innate harmony of life. We feel a sense of peace, and at one moment, at-one-ment, a resting place, so to speak. We can look at all sorts of architecture, but that which has been created by master architects employs sacred proportions in various ways, sometimes obvious, sometimes concealed, to achieve an effect on the observer, whether the intent was conscious or unconscious. There is a profound mystery that relates these sacred pattern forms and matter to human consciousness. There is sometimes chaos in form and matter, and there is sometimes harmony in form and matter. What allows us to distinguish between the two, to know when we experience harmony and to know when we experience chaos, are the sacred patterns in the unconscious. The ear can experience aesthetic sound and chaotic sound. The great masters of composition discovered the sacred relationships between sound frequencies and produced timeless classics. Composers have often said that the next note falls into place because of the notes that preceded it. So there is no choice when composing what turns out to be a classic piece of music. The composer is merely discovering the pattern that already exists. The music had already been struck at the pattern level. Pattern is not only experienced in the melody, but also in the intensities and in the relationships of sound to no sound. All these aspects can be appreciated in a classical piece of music. One distinctive quality of a classic is that it cannot be improved upon. It seems to be a perfect reflection of the ideal pattern that underlies the composition. Not one note or its timing can be changed if it is a true classic. If something can be changed, the piece of music is good, perhaps a near classic, but not yet a masterpiece. I observed this phenomenon while viewing the Venus de Milo in the Louvre Museum in Paris. No matter what angle I looked at the statue, it captured me completely. Less masterful sculptures may thrill the eye at certain views and yet assault the eye from other views. However, people can take pictures of the Venus de Milo from the back, the sides, the front, and a masterwork is still evident. Michelangelo's David in Florence, Italy, can also be viewed from any angle without one's losing the sense of viewing a masterpiece. All classics have this attribute. Every part reflects the perfection of the underlying pattern on which the work is based. You can try this with any statue. Note that for the vast majority of statues, there will be dead, in quotes, dead angles or views where the sense of the masterful collapses. The same holds true in the case of lesser musical compositions. Some parts work, others don't. The composer was not able to attune completely to the master pattern and went astray in places. Obviously, the same can be stated about any kind of art, painting or poetry, for instance. Sometimes the artist or poet can birth a painting or a poem effortlessly, one that is fully developed in which nothing needs to be changed. Here, the master pattern has been reflected perfectly and directly. Most of the time, though, the artist needs to struggle and wrestle with the material until the master pattern is finally revealed. I've often thought that the artists of words, light, sound, and matter create the many crises in their lives in order to maintain connection to the heightened states of consciousness that can directly access the primary pattern level of reality. A distinctive artist who has tapped one of the master forms can commit a whole lifetime to exploring a particular combination of energy, no matter what type it may be. Thus, perhaps the music, unique to such greats as Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Wagner, are actually intrinsic patterns of sound that each of these men discovered. The compositional modes and styles of Wagner or Bach or Beethoven or Mozart were not created by them, nor is the music unique to them, but rather each of them tapped a unique classical sound pattern that always was, is now, and forever shall be. The name of the composer gets attached to the master form or pattern that he or she discovers, but the composer does not actually create the pattern. The same would hold true for all distinct signatures in art, no matter what the medium. A well-known controversy raises the issue of whether Shakespeare actually wrote the masterful plays that carry his name. Could it be that William Shakespeare, relatively inept in his ordinary consciousness, may have tapped a master form of playwriting and poetry that transcended his outer awareness? His name gets attached to the form, but he may only have tumbled into the dimensions of awareness wherein the master patterning of Shakespearean plays exists. This is clearly similar in principle to the phenomena of simple brew and teacher brew, two very different aspects of myself, with very different resources, which are contained in the same body. Such a possibility may also account for people who, as they compose, claim to channel the music of Delius or Debussy or other composers. Perhaps they are in contact with the master patterning. Incidentally, the great problem with tapping a master pattern is that as an individual you can be absorbed into it and, psychologically speaking, die an early death. The pattern seizes you, and you are no longer free to express other patterns available to you. You become a stereotypic android. Many artists struggle with this problem. When they find one master pattern, its intensity is so great that they have difficulty breaking free from it to discover others. Not only might an individual become trapped in the expression of certain artistic patterns, but he or she might also become caught up exclusively in expressing the artist pattern itself, and thereby sacrifice other important patterns in his or her unconscious. Either of these alternatives means the death of individuation on the path of self-realization. This is why I noted in an earlier chapter that the saint be but one of the whole. The saint be but one aspect of the whole. To be absorbed only into one aspect is not self-realization. It is a sacrifice of multifaceted, individuated life to a single, eternally dancing form. The dance of patterns. Each of the master forms or patterns also has the power and stature associated with it. Whether a person is conscious or not conscious of what is happening determines whether that person gets seduced by one of these forms or learns how to draw from its wisdom and resources while continuing to deepen the awakening into selfhood. The outer mask, the dominant preferred sense of self, is never a full reflection of the forces that make up an individual. It's usually only a compensatory aspect, and to maintain it at the expense of the other aspects of self costs the individual dearly. Until a vehicle of consciousness is birthed into the awareness that can handle the unconscious forces, driving the psyche to wear the compensatory mask, no true awakening occurs. Furthermore, in the outer levels of awareness, the ego structure of most people can usually only sustain positive ego-enhancing images of selfhood, images that evoke universal loving responses and are particularly attractive to an individual whose underlying unconscious dynamics are those of unworthiness and self-rejection. What births the saints is the inner sinner. What births the saints? What births the saint is the inner sinner. The person who is attracted to the warrior image is not attracted only because of strong warrior-like inclinations, but also because an unconscious feeling of inadequacy and inferiority are active and present, driving the outer self into expressing the warrior. The larger population rewards and honors many of these compensatory masks, which are needed for collective completion, pleasure, or satisfaction, and the individual thus is tempted to become a sacrifice to the patterns of the collective for such rewards and honors. But the individual can become drone-like with no freedom of soul expression. If you can't give up the power that is yours through identification with the deity that is dancing you, whether it be the warrior, saint, healer, mother, father, or anything else, pleasant or unpleasant, you are seduced and in danger of losing your soul. The unique combination of selves that forms your individual beingness, which includes but is not contained by the outer sense of self. These themes are, in fact, what underlies stories about selling one's soul to the devil. What is not discussed, however, is that one can also sell one's soul to the saint, or to the good daughter, or the good son, or to the warrior, or to the monk, and be in just as much trouble as Faust got into. At least Faust realized his dilemma and managed to regain his soul, which rarely happens to the saint or the good son or daughter. Psychologically, they are unaware of what they have sacrificed, as the secondary gains are too wondrous to give up. How is the power of such master patternings broken? By surrendering the attachment to the power the master patterning provided. This may mean humiliation, powerlessness, chaos, and collapse of sacred value systems. But it also may mean the fulfillment of one's soul. As our culture sees it, being a failed sinner is not humiliating, but being a failed saint is. However, such prejudice is what seduces the immature. Being able to give up the attachment to good power is just as important as being able to give up attachment to bad power. It is the addiction to any power that enslaves the individual to a master pattern. There is a degree of absorption into a master pattern beyond which the individual psyche cannot balance itself, leaving the individual completely enmeshed in the master pattern for the rest of his or her life. The unconsciously held counterpart to the master pattern, that is, the sinner in relation to the saint, the female to the male to the female, the whore to the virgin, will constantly try to establish balance. And if the absorption hasn't gone too far, the eruption of the counterpart will establish psychic balance and harmony. Unfortunately, the individual's outer awareness, enslaved to any master pattern, will read this eruption as a test of faith or a test of loyalty and continue to generate even greater sacrifices to maintain the desired conscious polarity. However, the awakened path is to realize that the unseen or unconscious aspects of the self are real and form part of the whole. A saint is not holy without the sinner. A male cannot be whole without the female. A female cannot be complete without the male. The virgin is not complete without the whore. Through having been danced by patterns of the sun god, the divine child, divine mother, the purer, the Christ healer saint, the monk, the prostitute, the sinner, the artist, the magician, the orchestrator, the spiritual teacher, and the fool, I have some conscious realizations to share about such patterns. I know they are ever present in my unconscious, changing from time to time from latent to active, and back to latency again. They and others of which I am yet unaware form an orchestra and play my symphony. The only difference between my life in the past and currently is that a deeper, more mature aspect of me is becoming more conscious of each of them and appreciates each one unconditionally. What I know about my inner community of selves is this: they are in harmony with the unfoldment of my life. There may be parts that do not like other parts, but in consideration of the deeper purpose of my life, all aspects support its expression. In 1984, I was attending the Pure Christ Healer Saint patterning. The change was overdue. I was 45, and many who carry this particular pattern die before they reach 40. It is, in fact, an esoteric axiom. Healers die young. Death may come through illness, accident, or suicide. There is no right or wrong involved. It's simply part of the patterning. In October 1983, I had the following dream. I am given the opportunity to see the Book of Death, a large black book filled with the names of those who are already dead and those who will soon die. As I look through the pages of handwritten names of those who have died and those who are going to die, I unexpectedly run across my full name. In the date column is written Easter, 1984. In the cause of death column is written heart attack. I couldn't tell if the dream indicated a psychological death or an actual physical death. The problem for me was that as I examined my life, I sensed that all the great patterns to which I felt attuned were concluding. I felt as though death at that point would be appropriate. I began consciously to prepare for death, setting all my affairs in order and organizing each moment of time around an appreciation of life and of the soul-stirring experiences that I had had the good fortune to encounter. I saw death as a natural part of my patterning. I entered a month of complete surrender to the idea of cessation of being. Parts of me grieved and cried. Other parts were simply fascinated by the idea. Still other parts would panic and feel terror, and other parts were experiencing heightened awareness as Easter approached. 3 days before the Easter weekend, I had the following dream. I am sitting in a pastoral setting watching a strange event take place. A white, triangular tent, covered at both ends so that I can't see inside, is in an open area. I hear a small boy's laughter coming from inside the tent. Long, multicolored sashes tied together, forming a multicolored snake-like pattern, are being pulled into the tent through a sphincter-like hole at one end. Suddenly, seated next to me, appears an East Indian sage, about 40 to 50 years old, with a radiant face. He too is laughing. He is dressed in orange saffron robes, which he wears comfortably and casually. He has a graying beard. The sage informs me that I need a teacher to help guide me into my next initiation. He suggests that I go to the bookstore and see what strikes me as interesting. He then tells me to lie down on my stomach. He places one hand on the back of my head and the other on the lower end of my spine. And I suddenly feel a current of energy as though I were plunged into an electric outlet. I begin to cry tears of appreciation, and the sage tells me he is healing my body. And I awaken. But the most remarkable event was occurring. Though I had awakened from the dream, the current persisted. I was in bed, on my stomach, but still experiencing the sensation of his hands, one on my root chakra and the other one on the back of my head. The incredible current of energy coursing through my spine lasted some 30 to 40 minutes before subsiding. I interpreted the dream as follows. The pastoral setting signals the healing power of nature and of the natural elemental forces. The multicolored snake-like sashes penetrating the sphincter-like orifice of the pure white tent represent the fundamental mystery of creation, with the masculine energy fertilizing the womb and creating new conception, which in this situation is the laughing child not yet born. This is the new incarnation which will replace the form that is to die, as was announced in the pre-Easter dream. The boy child is basically happy and humor is natural to him. The womb is symbolized as the white triangular tent, reflecting the stability of the basic trinity, mother, father, child, and the virginal qualities of the womb that carries the new creation. The tent is on the ground, symbolizing the earthing of the new self. There is a single child in the tent, meaning that the twin energetics which I have carried with my actual twin brother have been integrated into a single individual. The long multicolored sashes, tied end to end, making up the masculine contribution to the union, suggest that many colorful personalities or selves will comprise this new manifestation, and that the child is actively engaged in pulling these parts of self into itself. The sphincter-like orifice was like an anus, the entrance into the mystery, just as with the mouth or with the vagina, because the first or root chakra is in this area. There is an implication of the awakening of the root or physical and instinctual state of consciousness with access to the Kundalini energy. It may also reflect the anal compulsiveness of the child. The boy child is still within the projection. No, the boy child is still within the protection of the womb and has not birthed into outer life. He is still gestating in my unconscious. As the child and the sage are frequently pairs in the unconscious, the healer sage is represented by the East Indian guru, who acts as a mature healing agent to prepare my actual physical body and my mind for the new incarnation. The East Indian's good humor again reflects the connection to the boy child in the womb and the humor in the family into which I was born in 1939. It also reflects the power of healing through humor and laughter, pointing to the notion that one can break the pattern of disease through the unexpected and disarming aspects of humor, which slices through deadly seriousness and cracks open doors to new possibilities. The suggestion that I go to the bookstore for direction was a gift that I took to be both symbolic and literal. Thus, I went to the Rainbow Bookstore, the only bookstore on the island that carried material which interested me, and there I discovered The Portable Jung, edited by Joseph Campbell. I had avoided Jung's work from the moment I heard about it. I knew if I ever began to study him, I would need years to come out from under his influence and discover my own creative center again. To my delight, however, some of his work simply validated what I had already discovered for myself. So it became a wonderful confirmation, as well as a profound opening into deeper and more difficult arenas I might explore. The healing experience in the dream was formidable. There is simply no question in my mind that my physical body had been reorganized into a healthy patterning that was capable of sustaining a new incarnation. My concern about dying died in the experience of the dream, although I realized that the new entity which would carry my life force, was already conceived and was gestating. I did not have any image of the vehicle that was to dance the next season of my life. I felt like the 19-year-old girl who had no role model for her own next staging. Then, 6 months later, I had the following short dream. I was facing a deep, dark pool of water. Slowly from its depths rises the body of a man. First, he's floating, face down, and seems to be dead. Then he becomes animated, and I see that he's actually a healthy older man, in his 70s or 80s. He stands on the water's surface, smiles, and embraces me as I smile and embrace him. My interpretation is as follows. The pattern of the elder was activated and birthed into my awareness from the depths of my beingness. This elder is related, this elder is related to Christ, which is apparent by his standing on the water. This indicates also that the elder is supported by the unconscious and rests on the unconscious. There has been a maturation from the young, mother-complected, purer energetics that Jesus represents into the mature elder. The embrace of the elder by my dream ego symbolizes the appearance at an unconscious level of the stage that is to embody my new incarnation. I was ecstatic when I began to fully fathom the implication of the short dream. Not only did I have an outer direction to unfold into, from maturity into elderhood, but also the culminating stage of the human cycle was going to be mine to experience in the outer reality. I had somehow survived the withdrawal of earlier patterns that often end in youthful death and had been picked up by the eldership pattern. I recognized that a long cycle of preparation, apprenticeship, and full empowerment of the elder was now awaiting.